Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really diving into something pretty complex but super important in Brazilian labor law.
Yeah, it's about outsourcing or terceirização, specifically figuring out the line between when it's legal and, well, when it's not.
Exactly. And we'll also unpack this term you hear a lot, pejotização.
Mhm.
We're using a legal analysis by Professor Sustenance Carvalho as our guide here.
Right. The goal today really is to give you, the listener, a clearer picture of your rights.
And the legal safeguards that exist against, improper outsourcing or these disguised employment situations.
We want you to be able to spot what legitimate outsourcing looks like, and maybe more importantly, how to tell when it's crossing into illegality.
And to do that, we're looking at a few things, right? Not just the professor's analysis.
No, we're bringing in the big guns.
Yeah.
Key decisions from the Supreme Federal Court, the STF, rulings from the Superior Labor Court, the TST, and also these practical guidelines from CONIFRET, that's the body focused on combating fraud in employment.
So multiple angles for a solid understanding. Okay, let's start at the top. Those huge STF decisions, ADPF 324 and RE 958.252, TIMA 725, sometimes it's called.
Yes, those were game changers. They basically opened the door saying outsourcing could be legal even for a company's main activities, their core business.
Which was a big shift.
A huge shift, as long as it was between two separate legal entities. But, and this is critical.
Uh-oh, there's always a but in law, isn't there?
Pretty much. The but here is that it wasn't a blank check. It didn't just wipe away other fundamental principles.
Like the primacy of reality, you mentioned that one.
Exactly. Primacia da realidad.
Yeah.
It means what's actually happening on the ground, the reality of the work relationship, matters more than what the contract says.
So the paperwork could say outsourcing, but if you're working like a regular employee...
The law might just see you as a regular employee. The substance trumps the form.
Got it. And even if the outsourcing is lawful on paper and in practice, there's still some protection. Subsidiary liability.
Yes, that's right. Responsabilidad subsidiaria. Even in perfectly legal outsourcing, the company that hires the service provider can still be held responsible if that provider doesn't pay its workers.
So if your direct employer, the outsourcing company, defaults on wages or something.
The company that contracted them, the main beneficiary of the service, might have to step in and pay. It's a secondary liability, a safety net.
Okay, that's a really important protection. So building on that STF foundation, what actually makes outsourcing lawful? What are the specific requirements? We're looking at Law 6.01974, especially after the updates, and those CONIFRET guidelines.
Right. So for outsourcing to be considered licito or lawful, several conditions absolutely must be met. First, there needs to be an effective transfer of the activity.
Meaning
the company hiring the service isn't just like borrowing employees. They're genuinely handing over the execution of a whole activity or service to the provider. That transfer is the core object of the contract.
Okay, makes sense. It's not just a personnel shuffle. What else?
Autonomous execution. This is a big one. The service provider has to carry out the work autonomously.
Autonomously. How so? What does that look like in practice?
Well, CONIFRET orientation, #17, breaks it down. It needs to be formal, administrative, organizational, finalistic, and operational autonomy.
Wow, that's a lot of alls. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Formal is in the contract. Administrative means they manage their own stuff. Organizational, they have their own structure. Finalistic, they're responsible for the end result. And operational is key. They control how the work gets done.
So the company receiving the service shouldn't be dictating the methods.
Exactly. They specify we need these offices cleaned, but the service provider decides the how, the cleaning methods, the products, managing the cleaning crew's schedule.
Okay. And that ties directly into the next point, which seems absolutely critical. No subordination.
Absolutely critical. The workers hired by the service provider cannot be subordinate to the company receiving the service.
So the managers at the client company shouldn't be giving direct orders to the outsourced workers.
Correct. The law is clear. The service provider hires, pays, and directs its own employees. If you're supposedly outsourced, but the manager at the client company is telling you what to do all day, setting your priorities, disciplining you, that smells like subordination.
And that would suggest it's not legitimate outsourcing.
It strongly suggests it. CONIFRET #17 again emphasizes the service provider must have exclusive control over the production process. The contracting company is just the recipient, the client.
Okay. Another point was about misuse of labor.
Yes, the contracting company can't just use the outsourced workers for tasks completely different from what's in the service contract. Stick to the agreement. That's Article 502A, Section 1 of the law, and Conifred Orientation, #18.
Right. And then there's this point about the service provider's economic capacity. It's not just about having a business registration.
Not at all. This is really important. Law 6.019 requires the service provider to have enough economic capacity to actually fulfill its purpose and, crucially, meet its labor and Social Security obligations. Pay its people, basically.
And Conifred adds more detail.
It does. Orientation #19 says this goes beyond just having the minimum startup capital. They need to be genuinely financially healthy, able to cover operating costs without massive debts hanging over them, whether commercial, labor, tax, whatever. They need to be a solid operation.
And the company doing the outsourcing, they have to check this.
Yes, they have a responsibility, a duty of diligence, to verify the service provider's economic health before signing the contract. Conifred Orientation, #19 again. They can't just turn a blind eye.
And what if the provider's finances go bad after the contract starts?
That's a great question. Conifred Orientation, #20 actually says that a loss of economic capacity later on can invalidate the outsourcing agreement.
Really? So the contract could become void?
Potentially, yes. Or at least the contracting company should take steps, maybe demand guarantees or reassess. If they don't, the whole setup could be deemed illegal later on.
Wow, okay. So a lot of conditions need to be met for outsourcing to be truly lawful. If they're not met, what happens? What's this mera intermediación de mano de obra?
That translates to mere labor intermediation. If those requirements for lawful outsourcing aren't met, it's not considered legitimate. It's seen as just illegally trafficking in labor, treating workers like a commodity.
And that goes against some fundamental principles.
Deep ones, like the idea, even back in the Treaty of Versailles and the Declaration of Philadelphia, that labor isn't just an article of commerce. It involves human dignity and rights.
So what's a concrete example of this illegal intermediation?
The classic one, drawing from the analysis, is direct subordination. The outsourced workers taking orders directly from the contracting company's managers, having their schedule set by them, their methods dictated. That's not outsourcing. That's just pretending someone else is the employer.
Right. Which leads us neatly into this whole issue of pejotização. Can you define that for us? It's a term that seems to worry a lot of people.
Yeah, understandably. Pejotização, coming from PJ, pessoa jurídica, or legal entity, is essentially when a worker is hired as a company, often a micro-entrepreneur, MEI. But in reality, they're functioning just like a regular subordinate employee, no real autonomy.
It's like a disguise for an employment relationship.
Exactly. Often done to cut costs and avoid labor charges and protections.
But wait, didn't the law we mentioned earlier, Law 6.019, say there's no employment relationship between the main company and the outsourced workers?
It does. Article 4DA, 280A. But another big but that applies only to lawful outsourcing. It does not give companies a free pass to commit fraud through pejotização.
Ah, okay. So if the reality looks like employment,
Then the primacy of reality principle kicks back in. If the core elements of an employment relationship are their personal work, regular work, non-occasional, subordination, and payment, Article 3.2 of the CLT.
the main labor code.
Right. If those are present, then Article 9.2 of the CLT and the Constitution itself basically say you have to recognize it as an employment relationship, no matter what the contract tries to call it. Fraudulent contracts are void.
And why is recognizing that employment relationship so vital for the worker?
It's fundamental. It connects directly to constitutional principles like human dignity and the social value of work. More practically, it means access to all the rights and benefits of formal employment. Paid vacation, the 13th salary, severance protections, FGTS deposits, regulated working hours, potentially union benefits, all the things pejotização tries to sidestep.
The source material mentioned a description of pejotização from Ronaldo Lima dos Santos. What were the telltale signs listed there, things listeners might recognize?
Yeah, that was insightful. Key signs include lack of real autonomy, the worker skills being core to the company's business, the company controlling the how-to or know-how, the worker's company having no real capital or resources of its own, often working exclusively for that one company, clear economic dependence, and the company, not the worker, bearing the real business risks.
So if several of those factors are present,
It's a strong indicator that it might actually be a disguised employment relationship, not a genuine business-to-business contract.
okay, this is incredibly helpful. Now, shifting gears slightly, what about the role of labor unions, sindicatos, and these public civil actions, or Ação Civil Pública, ACP? How do they fight against these illegal practices?
Unions have a constitutional right, Article 8, to 2, 3 to file ACPs to protect the interests, collective or individual, of the workers they represent. It's a powerful tool. They can go to court to challenge widespread illegal outsourcing or pejotização affecting their category.
Is there any debate about how far that power extends?
There is, yeah. Particularly around what are called diffuse rights, rights affecting a large, potentially undefined group. Some argue unions should stick to representing their specific members or defined groups. Others argue for a broader mandate to protect wider collective interests.
And the TST is looking at this.
Yes, the Superior Labor Court is trying to clarify the scope of union legitimacy for these broader actions in a case designated TEMA 27. So that's still evolving.
Interesting. And what about surprise decisions? How does that fit in?
That's about procedural fairness. The Code of Civil Procedure says a judge can't base a ruling on legal grounds or facts that the parties haven't had a chance to discuss. No pulling a rabbit out of a hat, legally speaking.
So everyone gets a fair shot to argue their case on all points considered by the judge?
Exactly. While the TST might have specific nuances in labor cases, the core principle is preventing unfair surprise rulings. If a union's case gets thrown out for a reason they never got to address, that could be grounds for appeal.
Okay. There was also a technical point about necessary co-defendants when challenging outsourcing. Who needs to be sued?
Right. Litis consorcio pasivo necesario. It's about who must be included in the lawsuit. There's a TST precedent, TAME 18, suggesting that if you're claiming fraud and seeking recognition of employment with the main company, you generally need to include all the intermediary outsourcing companies.
All of them. That could be complicated.
Very. And Conifred actually argues maybe that shouldn't apply strictly in all cases, especially when the public prosecutor's office is seeking an injunction just to stop the illegal practice. Requiring every single company could create huge procedural hurdles and block access to justice.
That makes practical sense. And finally, on unions, what about legal costs? Do they have to pay if they lose an ACP?
Generally, no. Unions are usually exempt from court costs and legal fees in these collective actions unless they acted in proven bad faith.
Why the exemption?
To encourage them to bring these important cases. It's about ensuring access to justice for collective rights without the chilling effect of potentially huge legal bills. A recent TST ruling, RR1E 648 35.2018.5.1E.0017, actually reinforced this very point.
Okay. Last major player to discuss, the Public Prosecutor's Office for Labor Issues, the MPT. What's their role here?
The MPT, Ministério Público de Trabalho, is huge. It's a permanent institution, basically part of Brazil's constitutional bedrock, dedicated to defending the legal order and social and individual rights that can't be waived, like fundamental labor rights.
And they act in different ways.
Yes, they can be the prosecutor bringing the lawsuits themselves, or they can act as a fiscal da ordem jurídica, a guardian of the legal order intervening in cases brought by others to ensure the law is upheld and public interest is protected.
And in cases involving potential fraud, like illegal outsourcing or pejotização,
their intervention as guardian is mandatory. According to the Public Civil Action Law and specific MFST guidelines, CCR Enunciados 27 and 28, when fraud is alleged in these labor contexts, the MPT must be involved to provide that independent oversight.
even if it only affects a few workers.
Yes. CCR Enunciado 28 makes it clear the MPT sees combating labor fraud as having broad social relevance, no matter the scale in a specific case. So in the situation analyzed by Professor Carvalho, the judge was legally required to bring the MPT into the loop.
Right. Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Key takeaways for our listeners.
Well, first, the STF did allow broader outsourcing, but it's not unlimited. It has to be genuine, meeting strict legal tests, autonomy, no subordination, economic capacity.
And if it doesn't meet those tests, or if it's just pejotização, hiding an employment relationship,
It's illegal. The reality of the work matters most,
and unions play a key role in challenging these practices through collective actions.
with some protection from legal costs, usually, and the MPT acts as that crucial independent watchdog overseeing everything.
It's a complex landscape.
Definitely. Which leads to maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Given all these legal details and how work keeps changing, how can you, as an individual, best figure out if your own situation is fair and legal?
And maybe flipping that, what's the responsibility of companies here? How can they ensure they're using outsourcing ethically and transparently, not just finding loopholes?
Yeah, big question. Staying informed is key, but it really puts the onus on both workers to understand their rights and companies to act responsibly. Food for thought, for sure.